In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world pauses between darkness and light, there exists a threshold where time feels different, where the familiar boundaries of a single human life begin to dissolve into something far more vast. If you have the time, settle into this moment, perhaps in full screen, and allow yourself to drift backward through the deepest current of all, the current that carries every face you've ever known, every word ever spoken, every thought that flickered briefly in the mind of someone who lived and died, without leaving a name. This is not a story with a clear beginning, though we must start somewhere, and it is not a story with an ending, though we ourselves exist within its unfolding middle. It is simply the long, unbroken thread of human existence, stretched across landscapes that no longer exist, through climates that have come and gone, beneath skies that have witnessed the patient accumulation of everything we now call civilization. The story of humanity is not the story of kings and empires alone, though they will appear here as they must, but rather the story of innumerable ordinary moments compounded across such spans of time that the mind struggles to hold them all at once. The story of hands shaping stone, of voices teaching children, of feet crossing impossible distances, of eyes searching horizons for something better or something safer or simply something new. We live now in a world so thoroughly transformed by human presence that it requires effort to imagine what came before, to reach back past the cities and the writing and the agriculture, past the monuments and the metals and the wheels, back to a time when humanity was not a dominant force, but a marginal experiment, a peculiar variation on an ancient theme, a small population of primates who had stumbled upon a strange new way of being in the world. This is where we begin, not at the beginning of life itself, not even at the beginning of primates or apes, but at that ambiguous threshold where creatures sufficiently like us to be called human first emerge from the deeper past, carrying with them the accumulated inheritances of millions of years, while simultaneously beginning to diverge from everything that had come before. The Africa of 300,000 years ago was not the Africa of contemporary maps and borders, not a continent in the political sense at all, but rather a vast theater of environmental transformation, a place where forests gave way to grasslands, where lakes expanded and contracted with the shifting rhythms of climate, where rivers carved new paths and abandoned old ones, where the barriers between isolated populations rose and fell like tides governed by forces too large and slow to perceive within a single lifetime. Somewhere within this shifting mosaic, among populations of archaic humans whose own histories stretch back into depths we can barely trace, there emerged individuals whose skeletal anatomy, whose brain cases and facial structures and limb proportions fell within a range we would recognize as anatomically modern, as Homo sapiens, as us. These were not the first humans in any simple sense, for the term human resists clean boundaries when applied to the fossil record, and they were not the first toolmakers, not the first to use fire, not the first to hunt cooperatively or care for their injured or bury their dead. They inherited all of these capabilities and behaviors from ancestors who stretch back hundreds of thousands of years, from species and populations whose relationships remain subject of ongoing investigation and debate, whose fragmentary remains suggest complex patterns of divergence and mixture, of isolated development and periodic reconnection across the vast geography of Africa and beyond. What made these particular humans significant in retrospect was not any single dramatic innovation, but rather a threshold that was crossed incrementally, almost invisibly, a threshold beyond which the capacity for symbolic thought, for language of sufficient complexity to encode abstract ideas, for culture that could be transmitted and modified and accumulated across generations, became stable enough to compound upon itself in ways that would eventually, over time scales of tens of thousands of years, transform the human relationship with the world. To exist as an anatomically modern human in deep prehistory, in the period before agriculture and permanent settlement, was to inhabit a phenomenological universe so alien to contemporary experience that it requires patient reconstruction to glimpse even partially. The daily life of these early populations was structured entirely by the imperatives of immediate survival within specific local environments, by the seasonal movement of game animals and the ripening of plant foods, by the locations of water sources and the availability of stones suitable for tools, by the presence or absence of predators and competitors and hostile neighbors. There was no writing to stabilize memory across generations, no institutional structures to coordinate action beyond the face-to-face scale of small groups, no accumulation of material possessions beyond what could be carried, No concept of ownership that extended much beyond personal tools and ornaments. No awareness of history, in the sense of recorded past stretching back through named generations. Yet these were not simple people living simple lives. And this is among the most important recognitions we must achieve if we are to understand the deep human past with any accuracy. The ethnographic record of recent hunter-gatherer societies, combined with archaeological evidence and careful reasoning about the cognitive demands of survival without agriculture or industry, reveals that the mental lives of foraging peoples were and are as complex as those of any human beings. Their knowledge of their environments encyclopedic in scope, their social relationships dense with meaning and obligation, their ritual lives rich with symbolism and emotional depth. The difference was not one of intelligence or capacity, but of context, of the specific challenges and possibilities presented by particular ways of life in particular environments. The toolkit of early Homo sapiens, in the period between 300,000 and perhaps 70,000 years ago, included a variety of stone tools produced by techniques inherited from earlier human species, primarily the Levallois method and its variations, which involved carefully preparing a stone core so that flakes of predetermined size and shape could be struck from it with precision. These tools, though sophisticated in their manufacture, represented evolutionary refinements of technologies that had existed for hundreds of thousands of years rather than radical departures. The archaeological record from this period shows regional variation in tool styles and production techniques, evidence of different populations adapting inherited knowledge to local conditions and available materials, but it does not yet show the kind of rapid stylistic change and symbolic elaboration that would characterize later periods. The presence or absence of clearly symbolic artifacts in these earliest sites remains a subject of careful investigation, with some researchers pointing to suggestions of ochre use, to occasional examples of careful burial, to the presence of marine shells far from the coast as potential evidence of symbolic thought, while others counsel caution about reading too much into ambiguous materials. What seems clear is that whatever cognitive capacities would later produce elaborate art and ornament and ritual were present in latent or partial form, waiting for some combination of demographic, environmental, or social factors to unlock their full expression. The genetic evidence, accumulated through decades of careful study of both modern populations and ancient DNA extracted from fossil remains, tells a story of deep African roots with complex patterns of population structure, movement, and mixture. All living humans trace their ancestry back to African populations that existed within the last 300,000 years, and more specifically to populations that underwent a significant expansion much more recently, but the details of this story resist simple linear narratives. The Africa of the late Middle Pleistocene was not inhabited by a single homogeneous population of early Homo sapiens, but rather by a structure of partially isolated groups, separated by distance and ecological barriers, occasionally coming into contact and exchanging genes and culture, each adapting to their particular regional circumstances, while maintaining enough connection to remain part of a single evolving species. Some of these populations contributed more ancestry to later humans than others, and some may have gone extinct without leaving descendants, and the task of reconstructing this deep population history from limited genetic and fossil evidence requires sophisticated statistical methods and careful reasoning about the effects of time on genetic variation. What emerges is a picture not of humanity emerging from a single point or moment, but rather humanity coalescing gradually from structured ancestral populations, achieving anatomical modernity first and behavioral modernity later, with a transition between archaic and modern humans characterized more by continuity and mixture than by clean replacement. The question of language, of when and how human beings acquire the capacity for the kind of complex recursive grammar that characterizes all modern languages, remains among the most difficult and important questions about human origins. Language leaves no direct fossil record, no stone tools or buried bones that preserve its presence, and we are left to reason backward from anatomy, from the structure of the vocal tract and the neural architecture required for speech production and comprehension, from the complexity of behaviors that seem difficult to coordinate without language, from the evidence of teaching and planning visible in the archaeological record. The descended larynx and the hyoid bone structure visible in modern human fossils suggest the anatomical capacity for the full range of speech sounds. But anatomy alone does not prove the presence of language, and archaic humans, including Neanderthals, shared many of these same anatomical features. The real question is not whether early humans could produce sounds, but whether they had developed a cognitive architecture for grammar, for the recursive embedding of phrases within phrases that allows language to generate infinite meaning from finite elements, for the symbolic representation that treats sounds as standing for concepts rather than merely expressing emotions. Some researchers argue that language must have emerged gradually, with simpler proto-languages giving way to more complex forms over hundreds of thousands of years, while others suggest that the capacity for modern language required specific genetic mutations that arose more recently and spread rapidly because of the overwhelming advantages they conferred. The archaeological record shows an acceleration of cultural complexity beginning perhaps 150,000 years ago and intensify around 70 to 50,000 years ago, a pattern that might reflect the full emergence of language as a stable system, though correlation does not prove causation, and multiple factors undoubtedly contributed to these changes. The environment of late Pleistocene Africa was subject to dramatic oscillations driven by orbital cycles and their effects on global climate, with periods of increased rainfall alternating with periods of intense aridity, forests expanding and contracting, lakes filling and evaporating, corridors of habitable land opening and closing according to rhythms that operated on time scales of thousands and tens of thousands of years. These environmental changes created pressures and opportunities for human populations, at times forcing them into refugia where they survived in relative isolation, at other times opening new territory for expansion, and creating conditions where separated populations could reconnect and exchange genes and culture. The ability to adapt to environmental variability through culture rather than through biological evolution alone, through learned behaviors that could be modified within a generation rather than waiting for genetic change over many generations, was already present in archaic humans, but became increasingly important as climate instability intensified. The archaeological record from sites across Africa shows evidence of humans occupying diverse ecological zones, from coastal environments where they collected shellfish and perhaps began to exploit marine resources, to highland regions with cool temperatures and different plant and animal communities, to the ever-present savannas and grasslands that have been human habitat for millions of years. This ecological flexibility, this ability to learn new subsistence strategies and transmit them to the next generation, was among the most important human characteristics, more significant in the long run than any particular tool technology or physical adaptation. Around 70,000 years ago, possibly somewhat earlier or later depending on how the evidence is interpreted, groups of modern humans began moving out of Africa and into the broader reaches of the Old World, initiating a process of global dispersal that would eventually place human populations on every continent except Antarctica. This expansion was not a single event, but a complex process occurring in multiple waves, with some groups reaching dead ends, others establishing lasting populations, and periodic back migrations into Africa complicating the pattern. The route or routes taken by these early migrants remain subject to investigation, with evidence suggesting both northern routes through the Nile Valley and the Levant and southern routes across the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the southern end of the Red Sea, possibly during periods of low sea level when the crossing was narrower. These movements were not purposeful migrations in the sense of people setting out with the intention of colonizing new continents, but rather the accumulated result of small-scale range expansions, groups moving into adjacent territories that appeared promising, following game animals or seeking better foraging grounds, or escaping population pressure or environmental degradation in their current ranges. Each generation moving perhaps only a few kilometers from where their parents had lived. But over thousands of years, these incremental movements added up to continental-scale dispersals. The humans who left Africa carried with them the entire cultural and genetic heritage of their ancestral populations, but they were entering environments that no human had ever encountered, environments with unfamiliar plants and animals, different seasonal patterns, different predators and competitors, different stone resources for tool-making. The Middle East, which appears to have been a region of repeated human occupation, and perhaps a staging ground for dispersals in multiple directions, was home during earlier periods to Neanderthal populations, and the genetic evidence now demonstrates unambiguously that modern humans moving into this region interbred with Neanderthals, incorporating Neanderthal DNA into their genomes in percentages that survive to the present day in all non-African populations. This interbreeding, once controversial but now firmly established, reveals that the boundaries between modern humans and Neanderthals were not absolute, that they were capable of producing fertile offspring, that the biological definition of species becomes ambiguous when applied to these closely related populations. The cultural interactions between these groups, the ways they may have influenced each other's technologies and social practices, remain more difficult to trace, but the long coexistence in some regions suggests contact ranging from conflict to cooperation to intimate relationship. As human populations expanded across Asia, they encountered diverse environments from tropical forests to temperate woodlands to cold steppes, each requiring adaptations in subsistence strategy, clothing, and shelter. The pace of this expansion, measured in the time it took for human populations to reach the far corners of the Eurasian landmass, was rapid by evolutionary standards but slow by the measure of individual lives, spanning thousands of years and hundreds of human generations. The archaeological record of these early Asian populations is fragmentary, with vast regions poorly explored and many sites destroyed or buried by subsequent geological processes. But key sites demonstrate human presence in India, Southeast Asia, and China by 60 to 50,000 years ago, with sophisticated stone tool industries that show both continuity with African traditions and local innovations. The watercraft required to reach Australia, which even at the lowest sea levels was separated from the Asian mainland by significant ocean straits, indicate planning and technology that go beyond simple coastal foraging, requiring the ability to provision journeys out of sight of land and maintain social coordination during passage. The fact that Australia was colonized by at least 50,000 years ago and possibly earlier demonstrates that humans had developed these capabilities by that time, making the initial peopling of Australia one of the most remarkable achievements of the Paleolithic period. The Australia encountered by these first human arrivals was a continent of extraordinary biodiversity, home to megafauna that had evolved in isolation, giant marsupials and reptiles, and flightless birds that had no prior experience with human predators. The rapid extinction of many of these species following human arrival has led to ongoing debates about the role of human hunting versus climate change in driving these extinctions, with evidence suggesting that both factors played roles, but that human predation, particularly of species with slow reproductive rates and no evolved wariness of human hunters, was likely significant. The Aboriginal Australians who descended from these first colonizers developed complex societies adapted to the continent's diverse environments, from the tropical north to the arid interior to the temperate south, with extensive knowledge of their territories encoded in oral traditions that stretch back, in some cases, to preserve memories of landscape features that disappeared thousands of years ago, suggesting remarkable continuity of cultural memory. The archaeological record of Aboriginal Australia shows the development of distinctive tool technologies, the use of fire as a landscape management tool to maintain desired ecological conditions, and the creation of rock art traditions that represent some of the oldest continuous artistic traditions in the world. The colonization of Europe by modern humans, occurring perhaps 45 or 40,000 years ago, brought them into direct contact with Neanderthal populations that had inhabited the continent for hundreds of thousands of years, perfectly adapted to the cold conditions of Ice Age Europe. The period of overlap between modern humans and Neanderthals in Europe lasted perhaps 5 to 10,000 years, a period during which both populations appear to have undergone technological and cultural changes, with debates continuing about whether these changes in Neanderthal material culture represent independent innovation, imitation of modern human techniques, or simply parallel responses to similar environmental challenges. The eventual disappearance of Neanderthals from the archaeological record, their extinction around 40,000 years ago, was once attributed to straightforward competitive replacement by superior modern humans, but the actual process was likely more complex, involving competition for resources in deteriorating climatic conditions, possible disease transmission, low population sizes making Neanderthals vulnerable to demographic stochasticity, and absorption through interbreeding rather than complete replacement. The fact that Neanderthal extinction occurred during a period of significant climate instability suggests that environmental stress may have pushed already marginal populations past the point of viability. The Upper Paleolithic period in Europe, beginning around 40,000 years ago with the arrival of modern humans and the appearance of the orignation tool industry, marks a visible acceleration in the rate of cultural change and the appearance of unambiguous symbolic artifacts. The archaeological record suddenly becomes rich with carved figurines, decorated tools, personal ornaments in the form of beads and pendants, musical instruments including bone flutes, and most spectacularly, elaborate cave paintings that demonstrate sophisticated artistic skill and almost certainly had ritual or symbolic significance. The Chauvet Cave in southern France, with paintings dated to more than 30,000 years ago, displays such technical accomplishment and aesthetic power that overturned earlier assumptions about the progressive development of artistic ability, revealing that the earliest known art was also among the most sophisticated. These European sites, preserved in caves that protected them from weathering and reused by humans repeatedly over thousands of years, have captured scholarly and popular imagination, but it would be a mistake to assume that symbolic culture only emerged in Europe or that European populations were somehow more advanced than their counterparts in other regions. Rather, the European caves represent particularly favorable conditions for preservation, and similar capacities for symbolic thought were almost certainly present in human populations worldwide, expressing themselves in materials and contexts that left fewer traces in the archaeological record. The question of what triggered this apparent explosion of symbolic culture, sometimes called the Upper Paleolithic Revolution or the Great Leap Forward, has generated extensive debate. Some researchers argue for a genetic mutation affecting brain structure or language capacity that occurred around this time, though the gradual nature of the transition in Africa, where earlier evidence of symbolic behavior exists, argues against a sudden biological change. Others point to demographic factors, suggesting that as population densities increased and populations became more interconnected, the transmission of innovations became more reliable and the rate of cultural evolution accelerated, with ideas and techniques spreading through networks rather than being invented and lost repeatedly in isolated groups. Still others emphasize the role of climate instability in creating pressures for innovation, with groups forced to adapt to rapidly changing conditions, developing more flexible and symbolic approaches to problem solving. The truth likely involves multiple factors operating together, with no single cause sufficient to explain the transition, and the recognition that symbolic capacity was present earlier, but required particular social and demographic conditions to fully express itself. The toolkit of Upper Paleolithic humans became increasingly diversified and specialized, with different tool types for different tasks, regional variations in style that suggest the existence of distinct cultural groups with their own traditions, and evidence of long-distance exchange networks in materials like high-quality flint, amber, marine shells, and ivory. The production of blade tools, long narrow flakes struck from carefully prepared cores, allowed more efficient use of stone, and produced versatile blanks that could be further modified into scrapers, knives, points, and other implements. The development of hafting techniques, attaching stone points to wooden or bone shaft to create spears and later projectile weapons, multiply the effectiveness of hunting by allowing humans to strike from greater distances and with more force. The invention of the atlatl or spear thrower, a lever that extended the throwing arm and increased velocity, represented a significant mechanical innovation, and the eventual development of the bow and arrow, probably by 20,000 years ago, though possibly earlier, gave hunters even greater range and accuracy while reducing their exposure to dangerous prey animals. The subsistence strategies of late Pleistocene humans were based primarily on hunting and gathering, with the relative importance of each varying according to local environmental conditions and seasonal availability. In environments with large game animals, cooperative hunting provided large packages of calories and fat, though success was uncertain and required considerable skill, knowledge of animal behavior, and social coordination. The butchery of large animals followed patterns that minimized waste, with meat consumed or dried for storage, hides processed for clothing and shelter, bones used for tools and ornaments, sinews for cordage, and even internal organs utilized for various purposes. Plant foods, though they often leave fewer traces in the archaeological record than animal bones, were likely the staple diet in many regions, providing reliable calories in the form of nuts, seeds, roots, fruits, and leafy vegetables, collected primarily by women and children according to ethnographic analogies, though we must be cautious about projecting recent patterns onto the deep past. The seasonal round, the cycle of movements and activities that follow the availability of different resources through the year, structured time and space in ways that have no parallel in settled agricultural societies, requiring intimate knowledge of vast territories and precise timing of arrivals at particular locations when particular foods were ready. The social organization of Paleolithic humans, reconstructed from the limited evidence of archaeology supplemented by ethnographic analogy and theoretical reasoning, was probably based on small, flexible bands, perhaps 20 to 50 individuals, related by kinship and marriage, moving together through territories they regarded as theirs, but without fixed boundaries or centralized political authority. These bands were not isolated, but connected through networks of trade and marriage exchange to other bands, forming larger regional populations of perhaps several hundred to a few thousand people who shared language and culture and could potentially gather for seasonal ceremonies or mass hunts. Leadership within these groups was probably informal and situational, based on demonstrated ability and personal influence rather than inherited position, with different individuals taking the lead in different contexts, a skill hunter organizing hunts, an elder with knowledge of traditions making decisions about ritual matters, a person with shamanic gifts mediating between the human and spirit worlds. The egalitarianism of hunter-gatherer societies, documented ethnographically and suggested by the relative lack of status differentiation in Paleolithic burials, was not absolute equality, but rather a system that actively worked to prevent the accumulation of power and resources by individuals through mechanisms of sharing, ridicule, and social pressure that leveled ambitious individuals and maintained group cohesion. The role of women in Paleolithic societies, often marginalized in older archaeological narratives that focus on male hunters as the primary agents of cultural evolution, was undoubtedly central to survival and cultural transmission. Women bore and nursed children, gathered plant foods that likely provided the majority of calories in most environments, processed hides and fibers, manufactured clothing in containers, maintained fires, and transmitted knowledge to the next generation. The so-called Venus figurines, small card representations of female figures with exaggerated sexual characteristics found at many Upper Paleolithic sites across Europe and Eurasia, have been interpreted in various ways, as fertility symbols, as representations of goddesses or ancestral figures, as self-portraits by women, or simply as aesthetic objects without specific symbolic meaning. The interpretation of these figurines remains contested, but their widespread distribution and the care invested in their creation indicate that female forms held significance in Upper Paleolithic symbolic systems, though the precise nature of that significance may have varied between cultures and contexts. The treatment of the dead in Paleolithic societies, evidenced by deliberate burials with grave goods and signs of ritual treatment, suggests belief systems that extended beyond the purely material world. The Neanderthals had already practiced burial, and modern humans continued and elaborated this practice, sometimes burying individuals with ornaments, tools, and ochre, sometimes positioning bodies in particular ways, sometimes including multiple individuals in single graves. These burials indicate concern for the dead that goes beyond simple corpse disposal, suggesting concept of an afterlife or continued existence in some form, though the specific beliefs remain inaccessible to us. The ethnographic record of recent hunter-gatherer societies reveals enormous diversity in beliefs about death, spirits, and the afterlife, and there is no reason to assume that Paleolithic peoples held uniform beliefs across the vast spans of time and space they inhabited. What seems likely is that humans had developed a cognitive capacity for concepts like the soul or spirit, for the idea that some aspect of a person continues beyond physical death, and that these concepts were embedded in ritual practices and oral traditions that gave meaning and structure to human life. The last glacial maximum, the period around 26 to 19,000 years ago when ice sheets reached their greatest extent and global temperatures were at their coldest, created severe conditions across much of the northern hemisphere, with ice covering large portions of North America and Europe, sea levels dropping more than 100 meters as water was locked up in glaciers, and habitable zones shifting toward the equator. Human populations during this period were concentrated in refugia, where conditions remained survivable, in southern Europe around the Mediterranean, in Central Asia, in southern China and Southeast Asia, in the unglaciated portions of Siberia. The genetic evidence suggests that populations underwent bottlenecks during this period, with reduced genetic diversity indicating smaller effective population sizes, though humans never came close to extinction as a species. The material culture of this period shows both continuity with earlier traditions and innovations adapted to the harsh conditions, with sophisticated clothing, including sewn garments with fitted seams, evidence of substantial shelters built from mammoth bones and hides in treeless tundra regions, and continued artistic production suggesting that symbolic culture persisted even under environmental stress. The mammoth hunting cultures of the Eurasian steppe, known from sites like Malta and Buret in Siberia and Dolny Vestines in Central Europe, represent remarkable adaptations to extreme cold environments. The mammoths themselves were keystone resources, providing not only meat and fat, but also ivory for tools and art, bones for building materials, and hides for shelter and clothing. The hunting of such large and dangerous animals required careful planning, deep knowledge of their behavior, and probably involved driving animals into traps or over cliffs rather than direct confrontation. The existence of substantial settlements with multiple structures, evidence of diverse economic activities beyond hunting, and artistic objects including the famous Venus of Dolny Vestines, suggests that these people were not constantly on the move, but established seasonal base camps where they could exploit locally abundant resources. The discovery of a triple burial at Dolny Vestines, with 3 young individuals buried together with evidence of care and ritual, including one with a disability that would have required community support, speaks to the social bonds and moral sensibilities of these people. The colonization of the Americas represents one of the last major chapters in the global dispersal of Pleistocene humanity, with humans reaching the Western Hemisphere much later than other continents, likely during or after the last glacial maximum. The traditional model held that the first Americans crossed a land bridge called Beringia that connected Asia and Alaska during periods of low sea level, then moved south through an ice-free corridor between glaciers once it opened as the ice sheets began retreating. More recent evidence has complicated this picture, suggesting that coastal routes may have been viable earlier, that the initial colonization may have occurred before the corridor opened, and that there may have been multiple waves of migration rather than a single founding population. The genetic evidence indicates that Native Americans descend from populations that originated in East Asia, with some groups showing admixture from more ancient populations that had separated earlier, and that the initial colonization involved a small founding population that underwent rapid expansion as they spread into an uninhabited hemisphere rich with game animals and plant foods. The Clovis culture, named after distinctive projectile points first found near Clovis, New Mexico, appears in the archaeological record around 13,000 years ago and is found across much of North America, leading to debates about whether Clovis represents the first Americans or whether earlier pre-Clovis populations existed whose remains are simply rarer or harder to recognize. Sites like Monte Verde in Chile, with convincing evidence of human occupation dated to at least 14,800 years ago, demonstrate that humans had reached the southern tip of South America by that time, requiring that the initial colonization occurred earlier still, possibly significantly earlier. The extinction of megafauna in the Americas, including mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, and many other species, occurred roughly concurrent with human arrival and the climatic changes at the end of the Pleistocene. The debate over the relative roles of human hunting versus climate change in driving these extinctions has continued for decades, with evidence supporting both factors and their interaction. Many of the extinct species were large-bodied animals with slow reproductive rates that would have been particularly vulnerable to even moderate hunting pressure, and they had no evolutionary experience with human hunters, unlike animals in Africa and Eurasia that had co-evolved with humans over hundreds of thousands of years. The rapidity of some extinctions, occur within a few thousand years or less across vast geographic areas, suggests that human predation played a significant role, though climate change at the end of the Ice Age undoubtedly stressed populations and made them more vulnerable. The loss of these megafauna had cascading effects on American ecosystems, transforming landscapes and forcing human populations to adapt to economies based on smaller game and increased reliance on plant foods. The end of the Pleistocene and the beginning of the Holocene epoch around 11,700 years ago marked a dramatic shift in global climate, with temperatures warming rapidly, ice sheets retreating, sea levels rising to near modern positions, and ecosystems reorganizing in response to the new conditions. For human populations worldwide, this climatic transition created both challenges and opportunities, disrupting established patterns of movement and subsistence, while opening new environments for exploitation and creating conditions that would, in some regions, lead to the development of agriculture. The period immediately following the Pleistocene-Holocene transition, known variously as the Mesolithic in Europe, the Archaic in the Americas, and by various regional terms elsewhere, saw human populations adapting to the warming world through technological innovations like the development of microlithic tools, small stone points and blades that could be set in composite tools and weapons, through increased exploitation of fish and shellfish as coastlines stabilized, and through more intensive use of plant resources, including the beginnings of management of wild plants through selective burning, weeding, and replanting that would gradually transition into full domestication. The process of plant and animal domestication, the fundamental shift that separates agriculture from hunting and gathering, occurred independently in multiple regions around the world at roughly similar times following the Pleistocene-Holocene transition, suggesting that similar conditions triggered similar responses in different human populations. In the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, the wild ancestors of wheat and barley were among the first plants brought under cultivation around 11,000 years ago, along with legumes like lentils and peas, while goats and sheep were being domesticated from their wild counterparts by about 10,000 years ago. In China, millet agriculture developed in the north and rice agriculture in the south by roughly 9,000 years ago. In Mesoamerica, maize was domesticated from its wild ancestor Teosinte through a remarkable transformation that required intensive selection over thousands of years, beginning perhaps 9,000 years ago, along with beans and squash. In South America, potatoes and quinoa were domesticated in the Andes, while manioc was brought under cultivation in the Amazon basin. In Africa, indigenous agriculture developed in the Sahel, with crops like pearl millet and sorghum, and in Ethiopia with crops like teff and coffee. In New Guinea, independent development of agriculture focused on root crops like taro and yam. Each of these independent origins of agriculture involved different crops adapted to different environments, but all followed a similar trajectory from the intensive use of wild resources to active management to full domestication, involving genetic changes that made the plants increasingly dependent on human cultivation. The transition to agriculture was not a sudden revolution, but a gradual process occurring over thousands of years, with populations moving back and forth along a spectrum from full reliance on wild resources to full dependence on domesticated crops and animals, with mixed economies combining hunting, gathering, and farming persisting in many regions. The motivation for this transition has been explained in various ways, from population pressure, making wild resources insufficient, to climate change affecting the availability of wild foods, to social competition driving individuals to seek surplus production that could be converted into social status, to the simple attractiveness of reliable food supplies that reduce the risks of starvation. Whatever the initial causes, once begun, the process of agriculture intensification created its own momentum through demographic feedback, with agricultural populations able to support higher population densities than hunter-gatherers, leading to population growth that made return to foraging impossible and required further intensification of agriculture to feed growing numbers. This demographic trap, once entered, locked populations into agricultural ways of life, even though evidence suggests that early farmers often work harder and had less diverse diets than their foraging ancestors. The domestication of animals followed its own trajectory, with different species domesticated at different times and places for different purposes. Dogs were first animal domesticated, probably from wolves that began associating with human settlements to scavenge or fuse, with a process of self-domestication followed by deliberate breeding producing animals adapted to life with humans, occurring perhaps 15,000 or more years ago, well before agriculture. Sheep and goats, domesticated in the Middle East by 10,000 years ago, provided meat, milk, and fibers for textiles. Cattle, domesticated somewhat later, provided labor for plowing in addition to meat and milk, transforming agricultural productivity. Pigs, domesticated independently in multiple regions, were efficient converters of food scraps into meat. Horses, domesticated on the Eurasian steppes perhaps 6,000 years ago, would eventually revolutionize transportation and warfare. Chickens, domesticated in Southeast Asia, provided eggs and meat. Llamas and alpacas in South America provided wool and served as pack animals in the Andes. Water buffalo in South and Southeast Asia provided labor in wet rice agriculture. Camels in Arabia and Central Asia enabled transport across deserts. Each of these domestications involved biological changes through selective breeding, with domestic animals becoming tamer, smaller-brained, and more morphologically variable than their wild ancestors, a consistent pattern known as the domestication syndrome that reflects changes in developmental pathways resulting from selection for tameness. The settlement patterns of early agricultural communities shifted from the mobile camps of hunter-gatherers to permanent villages that could be occupied year-round, built in locations with access to farmland, water, and other resources. The earliest villages, known from sites like Jericho in the Jordan Valley and Catalhoyuk in Turkey, housed populations of hundreds or even thousands of people in structures built close together, creating unprecedented levels of population density and new challenges of sanitation, disease, and social organization. The architecture of these early villages shows regional variation, but common features including substantial buildings with storage facilities, evidence of communal structures that may have served ritual or administrative functions, and defensive walls in some cases suggesting conflict between communities. The material culture became increasingly diverse, with pottery appearing to serve storage and cooking needs, ground stone tools for processing grain, and specialized equipment for various crafts. The appearance of prestige goods, items that served primarily symbolic functions and were unevenly distributed between households, suggests emerging social differentiation, with some individuals or families accumulating more wealth and status than others, a pattern that would intensify as societies became more complex. The shift to agricultural economies had profound and irreversible effects on human societies, setting in motion processes of population growth, social stratification, technological elaboration, and political centralization that would ultimately produce the urban civilizations of the Bronze Age. But this was not a simple story of progress from primitive hunters to civilized farmers, and it is important to recognize both what was gained and what was lost in the agricultural transition. Farmers could produce food surpluses that supported specialists, artists, craftspeople, priests, and rulers who did not directly produce their own food, enabling the accumulation of culture and technology in ways that foraging societies, where every adult had to be a competent generalist, could not sustain. Agricultural societies could support much larger populations on a given area of land, could build permanent monuments and structures, could develop writing systems to record information across generations, could organize labor on scales necessary for irrigation systems and other public works. But agricultural peoples also suffered from diseases of crowding, from nutritional deficiencies resulting from dependence on a narrow range of staple crops, from vulnerability to crop failures and famines, from a loss of autonomy as they became subject to political authorities, from the emergence of warfare driven by competition for agricultural land and resources. The archaeological record shows that early farmers were often shorter, showed more signs of disease and nutritional stress, and had higher infant mortality than contemporary hunter-gatherers, though their populations grew faster because of shorter birth intervals made possible by sedentism, the development of social complexity, the emergence of social hierarchies, political authority, and economic specialization, followed agricultural adoption with variable timing in different regions. In Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now Iraq, agricultural villages gave way to larger settlements by 6,000 years ago, and the first cities emerged by 5,000 years ago, with populations in the tens of thousands, monumental architecture, including temples on raised platforms called ziggurats, sophisticated irrigation systems managing river water for agriculture, and by 3,200 years ago, the invention of writing in the form of cuneiform script pressed into clay tablets. The Sumerian civilization that emerged in southern Mesopotamia established patterns that would characterize later urban civilizations, with centralized political authority in the form of city-states ruled by kings who claimed divine sanction, specialized craftspeople producing goods for trade and for elite consumption, professional scribes recording economic transactions and literary texts, priests maintaining temples and performing rituals to ensure cosmic order and agricultural fertility. The Epic of Gilgamesh, known from tablets copied and recopied over thousands of years in multiple languages, preserves in literary form themes that must have been ancient even when first written down: the relationship between civilization and wilderness, the inevitability of death, the bonds of friendship, the duties of kingship, the pride and tragedy of human ambition. In Egypt, agricultural communities in the Nile Valley were unified into a single kingdom by about 5,000 years ago, with the pharaohs claiming to be living gods and mobilizing vast resources for construction of pyramids and temples that served as monuments to divine kingship and cosmic order. The annual flooding of the Nile provided natural irrigation and renewed soil fertility, creating agricultural abundance that supported a complex society with elaborate religious institutions, professional armies, extensive bureaucracies recording grain stores and tax revenues in hieroglyphic script, and artistic traditions that maintain remarkably consistent stylistic conventions for thousands of years. The Egyptian preoccupation with death and the afterlife, evident in elaborate burial practices and massive investment in tombs, reflected beliefs about the continuation of existence beyond death and the importance of maintaining proper relationships with the gods and the dead. The pyramids, whatever else they represented, were demonstrations of state power, evidence that pharaohs could command the labor of thousands of workers for decades-long construction projects, serving no practical economic function but enormous symbolic importance. The Indus Valley civilization emerged in what is now Pakistan and northwest India by about 4,600 years ago, with carefully planned cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro featuring grid-patterned streets, standardized brick construction, sophisticated drainage systems, and public baths suggesting ritual importance of cleanliness. The Indus script, appearing on seals and tablets, remains undeciphered, leaving the civilization's language, political organization, and belief systems mysterious despite the extensive archaeological record. The relative uniformity of material culture across a vast area, the absence of obvious palaces or temples that dominate other early civilizations, and the apparent lack of monumental royal tombs have led to debates about whether the Indus civilization had centralized political authority comparable to Mesopotamia and Egypt or developed alternative forms of social coordination. The eventual decline and abandonment of the great cities around 3,900 years ago possibly connected to climate change affecting the river systems and agricultural productivity, left the region fragmented until new cultural patterns emerged in the Vedic period. In China, agricultural societies along the Yellow River and Yangtze River developed into increasingly complex chiefdoms and eventually into early states by about 4,000 years ago, with the semi-legendary Xia dynasty possibly representing a period of political consolidation before the historically verified Shang dynasty emerged around 3,600 years ago. The Shang dynasty left an extensive archaeological record including elaborate royal tombs, bronze vessels used in ritual sacrifices to ancestors, oracle bones were the earliest examples of Chinese writing used in divination practices, and walled cities serving as political and ritual centers. The Chinese development of bronze metallurgy, the practice of ancestor worship as a foundation of religious life, the use of writing primarily for ritual purposes initially before expanding to administrative and literary functions, and the emphasis on the proper performance of ritual as the basis of political legitimacy, established patterns that would characterize Chinese civilization for millennia. The concept of the mandate of heaven, the idea that rulers held authority only as long as they maintained virtue and cosmic harmony, provided a framework for understanding political change and legitimizing rebellion against unjust rulers. In Mesoamerica, the Olmec civilization emerged along the Gulf Coast of Mexico by about 3,000 years ago, creating massive stone sculptures, including colossal heads weighing many tons, developing a complex iconography with war-jaguar motifs, establishing patterns of ritual bloodletting and the ball game that will persist in later Mesoamerican cultures, and possibly developing an early form of writing. The later Maya civilization, flourishing from about 2,000 years ago through the first millennium CE before a period of political collapse in the southern lowlands, built elaborate stone cities in the rainforests of Guatemala and Yucatan, developed a sophisticated writing system that recorded historical events and astronomical observations, created a complex calendar that interwove multiple cycles to track vast spans of time, and practiced intensive agriculture that supported substantial urban populations. The Maya conception of time is cyclical rather than linear. Their belief in the interpenetration of the natural and supernatural worlds, and their practice of ritual sacrifice to maintain cosmic balance reflected a worldview fundamentally different from contemporary European and Middle Eastern civilizations, yet equally complex and sophisticated. In South America, complex societies developed in the Andes Mountains by at least 5,000 years ago, with monumental architecture, including U-shaped ceremonial complexes, appearing at sites like Caral in coastal Peru. The eventual emergence of the Inca Empire in the 15th century CE represented the culmination of thousands of years of Andean cultural development, creating a state that stretched for thousands of kilometers along the spine of the Andes, connected by an extensive road system, administered through a complex bureaucracy that used knotted strings called quipu for record-keeping rather than writing, organized around the labor tax system called MITA, and centered on the divine kingship of the Sapa Inca, who claimed descent from the sun god. The Inca achievement in organizing a state of this scale without writing, without wheeled vehicles, and without horses or other large draft animals demonstrates that civilizational complexity could emerge through alternative pathways. The development of metallurgy, the knowledge of how to extract metals from ores and shape them through heating and hammering or casting, was a gradual process that began with the use of naturally occurring metals like copper and gold that could be worked without smelting, advanced to the development of copper smelting by about 7,000 years ago, progressed to bronze, an alloy of copper and tin that was harder and more durable than pure copper, by about 5,000 years ago, and eventually to iron working by about 3,000 years ago. The Bronze Age, named for the dominant metal technology of the period, saw the emergence of the earliest states and empires, with bronze tools and weapons providing advantages in agriculture and warfare, though bronze remained expensive enough that stone tools continued in use for many purposes. The technology of bronze production required trade networks to bring together copper and tin, which rarely occur together naturally, stimulating long-distance exchange and creating dependencies between regions. The eventual development of iron working, which spread across the Old World between 3,000 and 2,500 years ago, provided a metal that was ultimately stronger than bronze and, critically, more abundant, since iron was far more common than copper or tin. The spread of iron tools and weapons transformed agriculture by enabling more efficient forest clearing and plowing, transformed warfare by making metal weapons and armor more widely available, and generally increased the pace of technological and economic change. The invention of writing, which occurred independently in at least 4 locations, Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and Mesoamerica, represents a fundamental transformation in human culture, creating the possibility of recording information outside of human memory, transmitting complex knowledge across generations without face-to-face contact, and separating the message from the messenger in ways that enabled new forms of political and religious authority. The earliest writing systems emerged from accounting systems, with tokens and marks used to track economic transactions evolving into more complex systems capable of recording language. The cuneiform writing of Mesopotamia, the hieroglyphics of Egypt, the oracle bone script of China, and the glyphic writing of the Maya all began as logographic systems, where symbols represented words or meaningful units, then gradually incorporated phonetic elements where symbols represented sounds, enabling the writing of grammatical particles and names and foreign words that could not be represented logographically. The alphabet, which represents speech sound with individual characters rather than syllables or words, emerged in the Levant by about 3,800 years ago, adapted from Egyptian hieroglyphs by speakers of Semitic languages, and was later modified by Greeks to represent vowels as well as consonants, creating a writing system of maximal efficiency and flexibility that could be learned relatively quickly and adapted to represent virtually any language. The spread of alphabetic writing through the Mediterranean world and beyond, carried by trade and conquest, made literacy more accessible than logographic systems, though still restricted to small elites for most of history. The emergence of literate civilizations does not mark the beginning of history in any absolute sense. Since history is simply the past and all humans have always existed in history, but it does mark the point where history begins to be recorded in writing rather than preserved only in material remains and oral tradition. The written records from ancient civilizations, inscriptions on monuments, clay tablets and archives, papyrus scrolls and libraries provide direct access to thoughts, beliefs, laws, economic transactions, and political events of people long dead, though always filtered through the biases and limitations of who had access to writing and what they chose to record. The vast majority of people in ancient civilizations were illiterate farmers whose lives are known only indirectly through archaeology and the writings of literate elites. And we must be cautious about assuming that the views of scribes and priests and kings represented the perspectives of common people. The laws, myths, economic records, and historical chronicles that survive from ancient civilizations provide invaluable evidence about those societies, but they represent partial and often idealized views of reality. The emergence of complex states brought with it organized warfare on scales that had no parallel in pre-state societies, with professional armies, fortifications, siege warfare, and military technology specialized for human combat. While violence was certainly present in pre-state societies, and there is archaeological evidence of massacres and violent deaths in some prehistoric contexts, the scale and intensity of warfare increased dramatically with the emergence of states that could mobilize large armies, invest in military technology, and coordinate campaigns of conquest. The reasons for this increase in warfare intensity were multiple, including competition for agricultural land and resources, the emergence of professional military classes with vested interests in warfare, the development of ideologies that glorified military conquest and legitimized the subjugation of foreigners, and the simple fact that states had the organizational capacity to wage war in ways that small-scale societies did not. The ancient empires that emerged in the Bronze Age and Iron Age, the Akkadian Empire, the Egyptian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Mauryan Empire, the Chinese dynasties, the Roman Empire, were all built through military conquest and maintained through the threat of force, even when they also brought periods of peace and stability within their borders and facilitated trade and cultural exchange across vast regions. The Axial Age, a term coined by philosopher Karl Jaspers to describe the period between roughly 800 and 200 BCE, saw a remarkable fluorescence of philosophical and religious thought across Eurasia, with similar patterns emerging independently in China, India, Persia, Israel, and Greece. In China, Confucius articulated ethical principles based on proper relationships, filial piety, and ritual correctness, while Laozi and the Taoist tradition emphasized harmony with the natural way and skepticism toward conventional social hierarchies. In India, the Buddha taught the path to liberation from suffering through ethical conduct, mental discipline, and wisdom, while the Upanishads explored metaphysical questions about the nature of self and ultimate reality. In Persia, Zoroaster taught a dualistic cosmology of good and evil, light and darkness, and the moral responsibility of humans to choose the right path. In Israel, the Hebrew prophets called for justice, mercy, and faithfulness to the covenant with God, criticizing the wealthy and powerful for exploiting the poor. In Greece, philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle laid the foundations of Western philosophy through systematic inquiry into ethics, politics, metaphysics, and epistemology. The reasons for this apparent synchrony across civilizations that had limited direct contact remain debated, with explanations ranging from the social disruptions caused by the spread of iron technology and increased warfare to the emergence of literacy enabling new forms of reflection and argumentation, to the growth of trade networks facilitating the exchange of ideas, to simple coincidence given the small sample size of ancient civilizations. What is clear is that the Axial Age produced frameworks of thought that would shape their respective civilizations for centuries to come, and in the case of Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam, which spread far beyond their regions of origin to become global religious traditions. The classical civilizations of the Mediterranean world, particularly Greece and Rome, have received disproportionate attention in Western historical narratives because of their perceived role as the foundation of Western civilization, but it is important to recognize that they were only one part of a broader pattern of cultural and political development occurring across Eurasia. The Greeks developed a distinctive form of political organization in the city-state or polis, with citizen assemblies participating in government to varying degrees depending on the specific constitution of each city, with Athens famously experimenting with democratic institutions that gave all male citizens regardless of wealth the right to participate in decision-making. The limitation of citizenship to free adult males, excluding women, slaves, and foreigners, meant that even Athenian democracy was far from universal participation, but it represented a significant departure from the monarchical and aristocratic forms of government that dominated most ancient states. The Greek intellectual tradition, with its emphasis on rational inquiry, systematic argumentation, and the search for general principles underlying particular phenomena, established methods and questions that would shape subsequent Western philosophy and science, though Greek thought also included much that modern science has rejected, from the four elements to the humoral theory of medicine to elaborate cosmological schemes based on perfect circular motions of celestial spheres. The Roman Empire, which emerged from the city-state of Rome to eventually dominate the entire Mediterranean basin and much of Western Europe, created a political structure that combined military expansion with remarkable organizational capacity, road networks that facilitated communication and trade, a legal system that evolved from customary law into a sophisticated jurisprudence, engineering works including aqueducts and public baths that displayed Roman wealth and technical skill, and a cultural synthesis that absorbed Greek culture while maintaining distinct Roman values of duty, military virtue, and civic responsibility. The extension of Roman citizenship beyond the Italian peninsula to include people across the empire, culminating in the Edict of Caracalla granting citizenship to all free inhabitants in 212 CE, created a degree of political integration unusual among ancient empires. Though significant distinctions remain between the Latin West and the Greek East, and the peripheries remain less Romanized than the core regions. The eventual adoption of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century CE represented a fundamental transformation, with the conversion of the empire legitimizing Christianity and providing the institutional framework for its spread, while simultaneously transforming Christianity as it adapted to its new role as an imperial religion. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE, traditionally dated to 476 when the last emperor of the West was deposed, did not represent the end of Roman civilization, but rather its transformation and fragmentation into the various successor kingdoms of early medieval Europe. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we call the Byzantine Empire, though its people continued to call themselves Romans, survived for another 1,000 years until Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, maintaining Greek and Roman cultural traditions, Orthodox Christianity, and sophisticated administrative and military structures that enabled it to weather invasions, religious controversies, and periodic losses of territory. The Islamic conquest of the 7th and 8th centuries, emerging from Arabia under the banner of a new monotheistic faith revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, created a new civilization stretching from Spain to Central Asia, preserving and elaborating Greek philosophical and scientific texts that had been lost in Western Europe, developing sophisticated mathematical and astronomical traditions, creating distinctive artistic and architectural forms, and establishing Arabic as a language of learning and administration across vast regions with diverse local cultures. The medieval Islamic world, often described as undergoing a golden age while Western Europe struggled through the early Middle Ages, demonstrated cultural and intellectual vitality through figures like Al-Khwarizmi, who developed algebra, Ibn Sina, who synthesized Greek and Islamic medical knowledge, Al-Biruni, who calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, and Ibn Rushd, who wrote influential commentaries on Aristotle. The Mongol conquest of the 13th century, which created the largest contiguous land empire in history stretching from Korea to Hungary, demonstrated the continued military effectiveness of steppe nomad warriors, while simultaneously creating conditions for unprecedented cultural and economic exchange across Eurasia. The Pax Mongolica, the period of relative peace and stability under Mongol rule, facilitated the movement of goods, ideas, and people along the Silk Road trade routes, enabling direct contact between Europeans, Middle Easterners, and East Asians, though it also facilitated the spread of diseases, most catastrophically the Black Death, which killed perhaps 1/3 of the European population in the mid-14th century. The fragmentation of the Mongol Empire into successor khanates, each gradually adopting the cultures of their conquered populations, demonstrated the limits of nomad political organization in governing settled agricultural civilizations, though Mongol influences persisted in the Timurid Renaissance in Central Asia, the Mughal Empire in India, and the Yuan and Qing dynasties in China, where Mongol and later Manchu rulers adopted Chinese imperial structures while maintaining distinct identities. The European Renaissance, beginning in Italy in the 14th century and spreading north and west over the following centuries, saw a renewed interest in classical Greek and Roman texts, humanist scholarship that emphasized human dignity and potential, artistic innovations in perspective and anatomy, and the gradual development of methods of inquiry that would eventually coalesce into modern science. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440 revolutionized production and distribution of texts, making books far less expensive and enabling the rapid dissemination of new ideas in ways that manuscript culture could not support. The Protestant Reformation, initiated by Martin Luther's challenge to Catholic doctrine and practice in 1517, fragmented Western Christianity into competing denominations, and sparked religious wars that devastated much of Europe before exhaustion. And the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 established the principle that rulers could determine the religion of their territories. The religious conflicts of the Reformation period, though appearing to modernize as struggles over arcane theological points, were deeply intertwined with political conflicts over authority and autonomy, with economic conflicts over church wealth and taxation, and with social conflicts over hierarchy and proper order. The European voyages of exploration beginning in the late 15th century, motivated by desires to find sea routes to Asian spices and other luxury goods, to spread Christianity, and to compete for wealth and glory, brought Europeans into direct contact with civilizations in the Americas, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia, initiating a process of globalization that would fundamentally transform all of these regions over the following centuries. The Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and people between the eastern and western hemispheres following Columbus's voyages, had devastating effects on Native American populations, who had no immunity to Old World diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, resulting in demographic catastrophe that killed perhaps 90% of the indigenous population within a few generations. This depopulation, among the greatest demographic disasters in history, facilitated European colonization of the Americas by removing much of the population that might have resisted, creating labor shortages that would be filled by the forced importation of enslaved Africans, and transforming ecosystems as European plants and animals filled niches left vacant by the collapse of indigenous populations and their land management practices. The Atlantic slave trade, which forcibly transported an estimated 12 million Africans to the Americas between the 16th and 19th centuries, with perhaps 15% dying during the Middle Passage across the Atlantic, represents one of the great moral catastrophes of history, producing immense wealth for European merchants and American plantation owners, while devastating African societies through violence, warfare, and the loss of millions of people in their most productive years. The enslaved Africans, stripped of their freedom and treated as property, created a labor force that produced the sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other cash crops that enriched European economies and fueled the early stages of industrialization. The descendants of enslaved Africans in the Americas created new cultures that blended African, European, and indigenous influences, preserved aspects of African musical and religious traditions while adapting to new circumstances, and struggled against their bondage through resistance that ranged from work slowdowns and sabotage to escape and rebellion. The eventual abolition of slavery, achieved gradually in different countries between the late 18th and late 19th centuries, came through the efforts of enslaved people themselves, free black activists, and white abolitionists who recognized the fundamental injustice of the system, though the legacies of slavery in the form of racism, economic inequality, and social division persist into the present. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries saw the development of systematic methods of inquiry based on observation, experimentation, mathematical description, and skepticism toward traditional authorities, producing new understandings of the physical world that contradicted ancient and medieval cosmologies. Copernicus placed the sun rather than the earth at the center of the planetary system. Galileo used a newly invented telescope to observe Jupiter's moons and support the heliocentric model. Kepler described planetary orbits as ellipses rather than circles. Newton unified terrestrial and celestial mechanics through his laws of motion and universal gravitation. And countless other investigators contributed to a transformation in how humans understood nature and their methods for investigating it. The philosophical implications of the scientific revolution, explored by figures like Descartes and Bacon, included new epistemologies that emphasize empirical evidence and systematic doubt, new metaphysics that conceive the physical world as a mechanical system operating according to mathematical laws, and new attitudes toward knowledge that saw it as progressive rather than complete, as something to be discovered through investigation rather than received from ancient authorities. The eventual application of scientific methods to chemistry, electricity, thermodynamics, and other domains during the 18th and 19th centuries created the foundations for technological revolutions that would transform human societies. The Industrial Revolution, beginning in Britain in the late 18th century and spreading to other regions over the following century, represented a fundamental transformation in human economy and society comparable in significance to the agricultural revolution 10,000 years earlier. The development of steam power, mechanized textile production, iron and steel manufacturing, railroads, and countless other innovations enabled dramatic increases in productive capacity. The concentration of manufacturing in urban factories, the rise of industrial capitalism as a dominant economic system, and the emergence of industrial working classes whose lives were structured by wage labor in conditions that were often brutal. The social consequences of industrialization included rapid urbanization as people left agricultural work for factory jobs, the emergence of new class conflicts between industrial workers and capitalists, the gradual development of labor movements and socialist ideologies that challenge the inequalities of industrial capitalism, and transformations in family structure, gender roles, and daily life as work moved outside the household, and communities adapted to urban conditions. The environmental consequences included unprecedented consumption of fossil fuels releasing carbon dioxide that would eventually alter global climate, pollution of air and water in industrial regions, extraction of resources on scales that began to strain natural systems, and the beginning of the Anthropocene epoch in which human activity became a dominant force shaping the planet. The political revolutions of the late 18th and 19th centuries, including the American Revolution establishing an independent republic based on Enlightenment principles of natural rights and popular sovereignty, the French Revolution overthrowing monarchy and aristocratic privilege while descending into terror, and eventually giving rise to Napoleon's empire, and the waves of nationalist and liberal revolutions in Europe and Latin America seeking political independence and constitutional government, represented challenges to traditional forms of political authority and experiments in alternative systems based on ideologies of liberty, equality, and nationalism. The tension between liberal capitalism emphasizing individual freedom and free markets and socialist and communist ideologies emphasizing collective ownership and economic equality, which structure much of the political conflict of the 19th and 20th centuries, with different societies experimenting with different arrangements and no universal model emerging. The extension of political rights gradually expanded through struggles by excluded groups, with the abolition of property qualifications for voting, the extension of suffrage to women achieved in most countries by the mid-20th century, the civil rights movements challenging racial discrimination and segregation, and ongoing struggles for the inclusion and equality of various marginalized groups. The 20th century saw accelerating technological change, political upheaval, and violence on unprecedented scales. The First World War, ignited by tensions between European powers and enabled by industrial technologies of killing, including machine guns, poison gas, and artillery, resulted in unprecedented casualties and the collapse of empires, with the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, and German empires all falling and being replaced by new states based on principles of national self-determination that proved difficult to implement in practice, given mixed populations and competing claims. The Russian Revolution of 1917 established the world's first communist state, attempting to implement Marxist ideology through centralized economic planning and single-party rule, eventually expanding to create the Soviet Union and inspiring communist movements worldwide. The interwar period saw economic instability, the Great Depression creating mass unemployment and political radicalization, the rise of fascist movements in Italy and Germany that combined extreme nationalism with totalitarian control, and the failure of international institutions to maintain peace. The Second World War, even more destructive than the first, mobilized entire societies for industrial warfare, deliberately targeted civilian populations through strategic bombing and genocide, culminated in the use of atomic weapons against Japanese cities, and resulted in the deaths of perhaps 70 million people, with particular devastation in Eastern Europe and China. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany, along with millions of others deemed undesirable, including Roma, disabled people, political opponents, and others, represents an extreme of human capacity for organized violence and moral failure, demonstrating how industrial technologies and bureaucratic organization could be directed toward genocide, how ordinary people could participate in or acquiesce to atrocities, and how prejudice and dehumanization could escalate to extermination. The shock of the Holocaust contributed to new international frameworks, including the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the Genocide Convention, representing attempts to establish global norms and mechanisms to prevent future atrocities. Those subsequent genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and elsewhere demonstrated the limits of these frameworks. The post-war period saw decolonization as European empires in Africa and Asia dissolved, creating dozens of new independent nations that struggle with the legacies of colonialism, including arbitrary borders, economic dependencies, and political institutions that often proved unstable. The Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union structured global politics for 4 decades, with proxy wars fought in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and other regions, with the constant threat of nuclear annihilation hanging over humanity, and with ideological competition driving both superpowers to support authoritarian regimes that align with their interests regardless of their domestic policies. The late 20th century saw the acceleration of globalization, with increased international trade, the spread of multinational corporations, rapid communication technologies, and the movement of people, goods, and ideas across borders at unprecedented speeds and scales. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 seemed to mark the triumph of capitalism and liberal democracy, leading some to prematurely declare the end of history. But the following decades revealed continuing conflicts over economic inequality, cultural identity, political authority, and environmental sustainability. The digital revolution, beginning with the development of computers in the mid-20th century and accelerating with personal computers, the internet, mobile devices, and artificial intelligence, transformed how humans communicate, work, learn, and organize their societies, creating new possibilities for human connection and knowledge sharing, while also enabling new forms of surveillance, manipulation, and social control. The recognition of human-caused climate change, driven by greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel combustion, emerged as an existential challenge requiring global cooperation to address, yet responses remain inadequate as nations struggle to balance economic growth with environmental protection and immediate interests with long-term sustainability. The story of humanity that we have traced from the emergence of anatomically modern humans in Africa 300,000 years ago, through the development of culture and language, the global dispersal across all continents, the invention of agriculture and rise of civilizations, the development of writing in complex states, the expansion of trade networks and exchange of ideas, the waves of empire and conquest, the transformations of industrial revolution and globalization, brings us to the present moment where more than 8 billion humans inhabit a planet thoroughly transformed by human activity. The trajectory of this history does not reveal simple progress from primitive to advanced, from savage to civilized, from ignorance to knowledge, but rather a complex process of accumulated change in which gains in some domains came with losses in others, in which every solution created new problems, in which cultural diversity gave way to increasing homogenization even as new forms of difference emerged, in which technological power increased far faster than wisdom about how to use it. The challenges facing humanity in the 21st century, from climate change to biodiversity loss, to nuclear weapons to pandemics to artificial intelligence to persistent poverty and inequality, require forms of cooperation and foresight that have rarely been achieved at global scales, requiring us to overcome the tribal loyalties and short-term thinking that were adaptive in our evolutionary past but threaten our collective future. Looking back across the full span of human history reveals both contingency and the inevitability of how we arrived at the present. The particular details of which civilizations rose and fell, which technologies were invented when and where, which ideas spread and which were forgotten, were contingent on countless individual decisions and accidents that might easily have gone differently. Yet the broader patterns, the increasing technological complexity, the growth in population and social scale, the elaboration of culture and knowledge seem to have emerged from the fundamental nature of human cognition and sociality, interacting with material circumstances over long time scales. Every human who has ever lived has been fully human in the sense of having the same basic cognitive and emotional capacities, the same needs for food and shelter and social connection, the same vulnerabilities to suffering and death, the same capacity for love and creativity and meaning-making. The differences between a Paleolithic hunter, a Bronze Age farmer, a medieval merchant, and a contemporary office worker are not differences of fundamental human nature, but differences of culture and circumstance, of the accumulated knowledge and technologies available, of the social structures and economic systems within which lives unfold. Recognizing this common humanity across vast gulfs of time and culture is perhaps the most important lesson history can teach. A corrected presentism that assumes a contemporary moment is uniquely advanced or enlightened, a recognition that our own beliefs and practices will someday appear as strange and limited to future humans as those of the distant past sometimes appear to us. The methods historians use to reconstruct the human past, from archaeology carefully excavating material remains and applying scientific dating techniques, to linguistic analysis tracing the relationships and changes in languages, to genetic studies revealing population movements and relationships, to the critical reading of written texts with attention to their biases and contexts, to ethnographic analogies drawing on the study of recent foraging and agricultural societies, have become increasingly sophisticated, yet the past remains partially opaque, resistant to full recovery, knowable only through fragmentary evidence filtered through our own contemporary concerns and categories. Every generation rewrites history not because the past changes, but because the questions we bring to the past change, because new evidence is discovered and new methods are developed, because the concerns of the present shape what aspects of the past seem significant. The history presented here, this long narrative attempting to trace the entire arc of human existence from the emergence of our species to present, represents only one of many possible tellings, emphasizing some aspects while necessarily passing over or condensing others, shaped by limitations of knowledge and space, and by particular choices about what matters most in the human story. Other histories would center different events and processes, would focus on different regions and populations, would emphasize economic factors or cultural developments or environmental changes or technological innovations, would tell stories of resistance and struggle by ordinary people rather than the acts of rulers and elites, would recover the experiences of women and marginalized groups rather than focusing on the dominant narratives of powerful men. The question of what history is for, why we should care about the deep past when practical challenges press in the present, has answers both pragmatic and philosophical. Pragmatically, understanding how human societies have dealt with challenges in the past, how they have adapted to climate change and resource scarcity, how they have organized politically and economically, how innovations have emerged and spread, how conflicts have been resolved or escalated, provides insights relevant to contemporary challenges, though the differences between past and present contexts always limit the applicability of historical lessons. Philosophically, engaging with the human past provides perspective on the present, revealing that current arrangements are not natural or inevitable but contingent outcomes of particular historical processes, that alternative ways of organizing society and understanding the world have existed and therefore might be possible again, that the scope of human experience is far broader than any individual can encounter directly. The long view of history reveals both human achievement and human tragedy, the remarkable ingenuity and adaptability that has enabled us to thrive in every environment and to transform the planet, and the persistent patterns of violence, inequality, and environmental destruction that have accompanied our expansion and development. In contemplating the full span of human history from the perspective of the present, we exist in a peculiar position. Looking back across 300,000 years of human existence, the vast majority of which was spent in small foraging bands leaving few material traces, through the relatively recent emergence of agriculture and civilization in the last 10,000 years, through the even more recent explosions of industrialization and globalization in the last 250 years, to arrive at a present moment of unprecedented population, technological power, and planetary impact, yet also a moment of profound uncertainty about the future trajectory of humanity and the stability of the systems that support contemporary civilization. We are the inheritors of everything that came before, carrying in our genes the accumulated results of natural selection operating over millions of years, carrying in our cultures the accumulated knowledge and practices transmitted across generations, living in environments thoroughly shaped by human activity, thinking thoughts made possible by languages refined over countless acts of communication. Every human alive today is the result of an unbroken chain of ancestors stretching back through every period discussed here and far beyond into the prehuman past. A chain that was never broken by early death before reproduction. A chain that survived diseases and famines and predators and accidents and violence. A chain that adapted to ice age climates and migrated across continents and learned new ways of making a living. A chain that includes individuals whose names we will never know, but whose genetic and cultural contributions persist in our existence. The relationship between the individual and history, between the single human life and the vast spans of time within which that life is embedded creates both meaning and vertigo. From a perspective of deep time, individual lives appear vanishingly brief, insignificant, quickly forgotten except in a few cases of rulers and artists and inventors whose names happen to be recorded and whose deeds happen to matter to later generations, yet from the perspective of lived experience. Each human life is the entire universe of meaning, the only existence directly known, and all of history exists only as it is experienced or remembered or imagined by living individuals. The historian attempts to bridge these perspectives, to see both the vast impersonal forces operating across centuries and the intimate experiences of individual people, to understand both the structures that constrain human action and the choices and accidents that shape particular outcomes, to recognize both the uniqueness of each historical moment and the patterns that recur across different times and places. This requires holding multiple time scales simultaneously in mind, seeing the long-term developments in technology or climate or social organization, while also attending to particular events and decisions that made the difference between different possible outcomes, recognizing that while individuals do not determine historical trajectories alone, they are also not simply product of impersonal forces, but agents whose actions, in aggregate, create the very structures and processes that appear to constrain them. The challenge of writing history on the scale attempted here, try to encompass the entire human past from the emergence of our species to the present, requires making choices about which details to include and which to omit, which regions to emphasize and which to pass over quickly, which processes to examine closely and which to summarize briefly, and these choices inevitably reflect priorities and limitations. A complete history of humanity, if such a thing were possible, would need to include every person who has ever lived, every decision made, every word spoken, every thought that passed through a human mind, an infinity of detail that would be both impossible to recover and overwhelming to present. What we can do is trace major patterns, identify significant transitions, highlight particular examples that illuminate broader trends, and attempt to convey something of the texture of life in different times and places while acknowledging the partiality and provisionality of all historical knowledge. The history presented here has emphasized prehistoric and ancient periods at some length, establishing the deep foundations of human culture and the slow accumulation of population and complexity, then moved more rapidly through later periods as the pace of change accelerated and the volume of historical information increased. This pacing reflects both the challenge of covering 300,000 years in one narrative and conviction that the prehistoric and ancient periods, often treated briefly in historical accounts that focus on recent centuries, deserve sustained attention as a majority of human existence and as the periods that established the biological, cultural, and social foundations for everything that followed. The question of progress, whether human history represents improvement or merely change, has divided thinkers since history began to be systematically studied, with some emphasizing the accumulation of knowledge and technology and the gradual expansion of rights and prosperity, while others point to persistent violence and inequality and the loss of older ways of life that had their own value and integrity. Both perspectives contain truth, and the attempt to render a final judgment on whether history represents progress depends on values and priorities that are themselves historically contingent and culturally specific. From a perspective of material prosperity and technological capability, the average person alive today in a wealthy industrialized country enjoys comforts and possibilities that were unavailable to even the most powerful rulers of ancient civilizations, with access to medicine that has dramatically reduced infant mortality and extended life expectancy, to food varieties from around the world, to instant communication with people anywhere on the planet, to accumulated knowledge vastly, exceeding what any individual could learn in a lifetime. From a perspective of autonomy and equality, many people today have legal rights and social freedoms that were unimaginable to most humans throughout history, though these remain unevenly distributed and subject to ongoing struggle. From a perspective of meaning and community, the loss of stable traditions and face-to-face communities, the anonymity of mass society, the erosion of connections to place and to the natural world, represent losses that material prosperity does not necessarily compensate. And the mental health challenges visible in contemporary wealthy societies suggest that affluence and individual freedom do not automatically produce human flourishing. The relationship between knowledge and wisdom, between accumulated information and understanding of how to live well, between technical capability and moral development raises questions about whether humanity has progressed in all the ways that matter. We know vastly more than our ancestors about the physical world, about the universe and the planet and the mechanisms of life. Yet it is not clear that we are wiser about the fundamental questions of meaning and value, and how to live together peacefully. The great moral and philosophical traditions emerged thousands of years ago and still speak to contemporary concerns, suggesting that certain human questions and certain insights into those questions remain remarkably stable across time, even as the particular circumstances of life transform. The relationship between individual and community, the tension between freedom and security, the challenge of limiting the powerful and protecting the vulnerable, the search for meaning in the face of mortality, the proper relationship between humans and nature. These questions were already being wrestled with by thinkers in the axial age and have no final answers, only ongoing negotiations and temporary settlements that must be renewed by each generation in their own context. The concept of historical consciousness, the awareness of existing in history, rather than in an eternal present or a cyclical time, without cumulative change, itself as a history, emerging gradually in different civilizations and shaping how people understood their relationship to past and future. In societies with oral traditions and without written records, the past might extend back a few generations to living memory and remembered ancestors, with more distant origins preserved in myths that explain the origin of the world and the people but did not constitute history in the sense of a chronicle of events. The development of written historical chronicles, attempting to record events in sequence and establish what happened when and why, emerged in literate civilizations and was shaped by various purposes, from celebrating rulers and legitimizing their authority, to recording divine interventions and interpreting their meaning, to simply preserving memory of significant events for future reference. The modern historical method, emphasizing critical evaluation of sources, attention to bias and perspective, use of multiple lines of evidence, and tentative conclusions subject to revision, emerged gradually in Europe beginning in the Renaissance and has become the standard approach in academic history worldwide, though many different modes of engaging with the past persist, from religious histories that interpret events as manifestations of divine will, to nationalist histories that celebrate the nation and its heroes, to family genealogies that trace personal connections to the past, to heritage movements that seek to preserve and celebrate particular cultural traditions. The acceleration of historical change, the sense that the pace of transformation has increased dramatically in recent centuries and particularly in recent decades, reflects real changes in the rate at which new technologies are adopted, old institutions are transformed, and ways of life are disrupted. A person born in the early 19th century and living into the early 20th century would have witnessed the coming of railroads, telegraphs, telephones, automobiles, airplanes, electric lights, photography, cinema, and countless other innovations that transformed daily life and social possibilities. A person born in the early 20th century and living into the early 21st century would have witnessed the coming of television, computers, the internet, mobile phones, space exploration, nuclear weapons, jet travel, antibiotics, and genetic engineering, an even more dramatic set of transformations over a similar lifespan. The human capacity to adapt to such rapid change, to treat as normal what would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations, is remarkable but also creates challenges, as the pace of change strains institutions and creates gaps between generations who have grown up in effectively different worlds. The psychological and social effects of living through rapid technological and cultural change, the loss of stable traditions and predictable life trajectories, the constant need to learn new skills and adapt to new systems, create both opportunities for flexibility and creativity and stresses that manifest in various forms of anxiety and nostalgia. The question of what might come next, how the human story might continue beyond the present moment, involves extrapolating current trends while recognizing that unexpected events and innovations can redirect trajectories in ways that are difficult or impossible to predict. The challenges are clear enough, from the need to transition away from fossil fuels to avoid catastrophic climate change, to the need to address persistent global poverty and inequality, to the need to develop governance structures adequate to coordinate action on planetary scale problems, to the need to navigate the implications of emerging technologies from artificial intelligence to genetic engineering, to possible future developments we cannot yet imagine. The uncertainties are equally clear. with the potential for both catastrophic failures that dramatically reduce human population and welfare, and for breakthroughs that enable flourishing in ways currently difficult to envision. History provides no guarantees, no assurance that problems will be solved or that humanity will successfully navigate the challenges ahead, but it does demonstrate remarkable human capacity for adaptation, innovation, and resilience in the face of difficulties. The same species that survived the Ice Age with Paleolithic technology, that independently invented agriculture in multiple regions, that built civilizations in diverse environments, that survived wars and plagues and famines and revolutions, possesses resources of creativity and cooperation that might yet prove adequate to contemporary challenges. Though success is far from assured and will require wisdom and solidarity that have often been in short supply. In the end, the value of contemplating human history on the longest time scale is not primarily to extract lessons that can be mechanically applied to present problems, though insights do emerge, but rather to cultivate perspective on a human condition. To see ourselves as part of a long continuity of humans facing challenges and seizing opportunities, to recognize both what has changed and what persists, to understand that our own moment is neither the apex of history nor simply another point in an undifferentiated sequence, but rather a unique moment with its own particular possibilities and constraints shaped by everything that came before. The humans who emerged in Africa 300,000 years ago and the humans alive today are the same species, with the same fundamental biological and psychological characteristics, yet they inhabited and inhabit vastly different worlds, worlds that we ourselves have created through the accumulated effects of culture operating over vast spans of time. We are both the inheritors and the creators of human history, both determined by the past that shapes our circumstances and our possibilities, and agents who through our choices contribute to shaping what comes next. The story of humanity is not complete, has no final chapter, continues to unfold with each generation and each individual life, and the outcome remains uncertain, dependent on choices yet to be made and events yet to happen. What we can say with confidence is that the capacity for symbolic thought, for language and culture, for cooperation and innovation that characterize our species from its beginnings, persists still and will shape whatever futures emerge. The long arc of human history, viewed from this moment in the early 21st century, reveals no simple pattern of progress or decline, but rather a complex tapestry of continuity and change, of achievement and tragedy, of ordinary people living their lives within the limits of their circumstances, while collectively creating trajectories that exceed any individual intention, producing this present moment where we exist as a temporary culmination of everything that came before and the potential origin of everything that might come after.